Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Costain. The Global Terrorism Index 2023 shows that the 10 countries most impacted by terrorism are also experiencing poverty, weak governance and conflict. Food and water scarcity, in part linked to climate change, act as a threat multiplier, accelerating instability. David Wells is the former head of research and analysis for the UN's Counter-Terrorism Directorate. I started by asking him how climate change is affecting terrorist recruitment.
I think the first thing I'd say is that it remains an understudied issue. Climate just isn't something that counter-terrorism policymakers and practitioners have given a huge amount of thought to. So it's something that's still a relatively emerging issue. But I think there are two key ways in which they're connected. The first is that climate change acts as a sort of driver or exacerbates a lot of the drivers that underlie radicalization to terrorism. So we're talking about conflict, poverty, instability, poor governance. We know that climate change drives a lot of those things, and those things in turn are key drivers to recruitment for terrorist groups as well. The second way is in terms of extreme weather events. So we've seen a growing number of extreme weather events around the world, and we've also seen numerous examples where terrorist groups have sought to exploit those. So we've seen examples where, for example, a big earthquake in Pakistan, a terrorist group was able to get to the affected communities quicker, provide humanitarian aid, support in a way that the government just wasn't capable of doing. And so that provides a great opportunity in terms of propaganda, in terms of legitimacy, to show that these terrorist groups are not just violent actors, but they're also potentially alternative government. So that's something we've seen across the world. I'd say the most prevalent areas would probably be South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and obviously Iraq and Syria in particular, and then across large swathes of the African continent as well. So we're seeing that in the north, the west, and the east, and increasingly in the south as well, unfortunately.
Now, when you say that climate change is an emerging issue, it's just starting to, be talked about within areas of policy that are interested in terrorism. It's something that we tend to talk about in terms of security is not just climate change, but also the way that climate change interacts with biodiversity loss and with desertification. And we bundle that together in terms of ecological security. Is the conversation that's emerging around climate change recognizing these other ecological factors, or is it still primarily focused on climate itself?
Yeah, we have seen a bit more of a discussion around some of those factors as well. For example, the shrinking of Lake Chad Basin that we've seen over the last decade or more, and the impact that's had on traditional communities operating in that area. A lot of them employed as herders, and seeing smaller and smaller amounts of water available and what alternatives there might be for them in terms of employment. And so certainly African governments and West African governments in particular have cited that, a more of an ecological factor as something that is driving recruitment to Boko Haram and some of the other terrorist groups operating in that area.
David, I wonder how food scarcity in particular is exploited by irregular militia and terror groups.
Yeah, I think it's, again, it's something I've touched on already, the legitimacy question. So we've seen, particularly in Somalia, where large parts of the country have suffered from both drought and famine for a good part of the last 2 decades, if not more. The Al-Shabaab, the Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorist group that controls a significant proportion of the country, has always sought to take advantage of those sorts of situations. So that might be trying to exploit the provision of humanitarian aid to fundraise, but also more of a quid pro quo kind of way, where if they have access to food, communities that don't have access to food may be provided that food, but there's obviously something expected in exchange in terms of logistical support. There might be taxes levied, extortion, those types of things. So I think it's both a financial thing and a coercion thing. But again, the legitimacy question of if Al-Shabaab are able to provide food in areas the country and the government, the legitimate government, isn't able to do so elsewhere, it gives Al-Shabaab the impression of being a legitimate government actor. And then I guess the final point is, again, as a driver to radicalization and recruitment, we know that food scarcity and poverty is a factor for sure. And again, to take the Al-Shabaab example, if you can't provide for your family, food is scarce, and you can get paid a pretty healthy wage to be a member of a terrorist group who will look after your family, it becomes nothing really to do with ideology and everything to do about poverty and the food scarcity as a driver of that.
In these areas that have already succumbed to famine, I wonder whether governments and NGOs are finding that they actually have to engage with terror groups just in order to get food to starving people.
Yeah, it's been a long-standing issue and a really problematic one, actually, because the US has very far-reaching countering the finance of terrorism legislation, which means that any individual or group providing material support to a designated terrorist group can be prosecuted for that. So a lot of NGOs have really struggled in different scenarios around the world where they do need to provide humanitarian aid to individuals who live in areas under the control of terrorist groups. There have been some country-specific exemptions made at UN level, but at the end of last year, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2664, which provides a general carve-out or exemption for NGOs to be able to provide humanitarian aid in those scenarios. So that's a big step forward. It's not 100% sure how that's going to pay out. But obviously, that does remain a significant challenge, as discussed. Terrorist groups will seek to take advantage of those opportunities. They will seek to make money out of it, to have additional control out of it. But obviously, it's great that this exemption now exists, because the humanitarian principle needs to be central and is critically important to the individuals in communities who have had often absolutely no choice in the matter in terms of where they're located and the terrorist groups controlling those areas.
And what's being done to reduce the stranglehold that these terror groups have on poor communities?
Yeah, it's a question the world's been wrestling with for decades now, and I think despite some progress in certain parts of the world, it remains a significant challenge, and again remains a particular challenge in parts of the world that are particularly impacted by climate change. And so what we see in a lot of those areas, including large parts of Africa and in the Middle East, is that it's a very militarized, securitized approach. It's understandable considering the scale of the challenge, but what happens because of that is we see human rights abuses, we see displacement, we see migration away from conflict areas, and all of those things are problematic in other ways as well. There hasn't been enough of a focus, I think, on prevention and some of these more strategic, longer-term approaches, and partly that is because the world has been kind of fighting fires across the world with different terrorist hotspots. But I think now is a really good opportunity to be a bit more preventative and a bit more long-term, and connecting terrorism to other policy areas, including climate change and food scarcity.
Do you think that the security community and other actors, within the United Nations and the global community are actually becoming better? I know that you talk about this being a good opportunity. You talk about this is something that you want to see. Are they becoming perhaps less reactive and more strategic in that approach, do you think?
I think they are, but I think it's coming at the same time as a decrease in priority for counterterrorism. So it's a real challenge when we're seeing much more great power rivalry, obviously conflict in Ukraine, all sorts of other crises which take priority, understandably, away from counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism. So I think there have been some improvements. I still think there's much more work to be done at integrating some other global societal challenges, including climate change, within those responses. And I think there is a real opportunity to look at some of these preventive measures or programs that have been rolled out over the last decade and see if they can be better integrated with mitigation and adaptation, climate change responses as well. I think that's where there's a real opportunity to connect some of those dots, particularly the kind of programming we've seen quite regularly, which is vocationally focused, and to think about how we can connect those dots and be a bit more strategic in our response.
David, do you think that there's an assumption within the international policy community that ecological insecurity will simply increase exponentially? Or do you think that there's a recognition that agroecological land management could substantially improve resilience to the impacts of climate change and even substantially reverse desertification, one of the chief causes of hunger?
Yeah, I mean, certainly speaking from within a relatively narrow sort of counterterrorism security policy area, it's not something that's widely discussed. And I think that's possibly partly because the areas affected, in particularly about West Africa and East Africa as well, there's so much desperation around the kind of importance of the kind of security challenge that kind of takes precedence over some of those longer term thinking and some of that, connecting those disparate challenges and saying, well, there is something we can do about this. It's not inevitable. We don't have to just give in on the climate challenge and accept that these things are going to occur. But I think there's a lot more work to be done again about connecting different policy areas, particularly at the UN, to make sure those responses take into account all of those different factors.
And do you think, just finally, David, do you think that that's something that should happen, that those communities that are invested in security issues should be having those conversations in a more strategic way? Or do you think that, the way that these link to hunger, the way that these things link to agroecology, is that somebody else's job and you just need to be in a kind of a position of listening rather than actively engaging?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of $1 million question. I think particularly the UN, climate change has been viewed as a development issue, not a security issue. And I think there have been concerns around securitizing that response and what impact that would have. So I do think to a large extent, the UN, the security kind of sector has taken a step back and said this is a development problem that needs to be dealt with by those sorts of organizations and parts of the UN. I think the real challenge there is if you're not talking to each other, you can have some really great programs focused on agriculture, focused on water quality and all those sorts of issues. But if you then have a securitized response simultaneously happening in similar locations, there's just no, it's not necessarily joined up, and you obviously don't increase your chances of success. So I think the security community has to tread carefully. It's something that other policy areas have seen, that when terrorism is banded around, security takes precedence over everything else. And that's certainly not what I'm arguing for. I actually think that because of the urgency of the climate challenge, that has to take primacy. And it's more of a question of where the counter-terrorism issue can fit within that in a kind of appropriate way, and where it can play a role, certainly in terms of resourcing or prioritization, to make sure those things are joined up.
That was independent global security consultant David Wells. More about this and our other headline news on our website, 8point9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.